May 26, 1940. The beaches of Dunkirk groaned under the weight of a collapsing army. Sand was littered with discarded rifles, overturned helmets, and men too exhausted to even raise their heads. Smoke coiled from burning fuel depots, drifting low over the channel like a suffocating blanket. To German officers watching from captured positions inland, it looked like the end of Britain's war. 400,000 Allied soldiers trapped between steel and sea. Luftwaffe sorties screamed overhead, bombing at will. To Berlin, it seemed certain the Allies were finished. But the scene on the ground defied simple arithmetic. Columns of soldiers, though leaderless and shattered, refused to surrender. They formed lines in the shallow surf, water lapping at their knees, eyes fixed westward toward the horizon. German intelligence reports that day recorded confidence. They are cornered. They cannot escape. Yet the battlefield held a mystery the enemy could not see. As night fell, campfires flickered against the dunes, but discipline still pulsed through the ranks. Men shared rations, half-eaten tins of bully beef, lukewarm tea brewed over petrol stoves. German artillery thundered, but the lines remained strangely calm, as if they were waiting for something invisible. By morning, that invisible thread revealed itself. Binoculars mounted in German command posts suddenly caught glints of movement offshore, small shapes, hardly larger than fishing vessels, pushing toward the beaches through smoke and shell splashes. They weren't destroyers or battleships. They were wooden hulls, too fragile to belong here, too ordinary to be part of a military plan. The officers assumed desperation. Perhaps a few dozen men would be ferried out, a symbolic gesture at best. But on the sand, heads lifted. Soldiers pointed and began to shout across the din of shell fire. Hope, against every calculation, had arrived in the shape of civilian boats. What looked like scattered madness in that first morning was only the beginning. The trickle of small boats would grow, multiplying day by day, until even hardened German officers felt disbelief harden into dread. Because what was crossing the channel was not just ships, it was the will of a nation. And when the first of those fishing boats nosed into the surf, the story of Dunkirk shifted forever.
Through the smoke haze of the channel, German spotters steadied their binoculars and frowned. Against all logic, fragile silhouettes emerged from the mist. Wooden fishing boats, sail-driven pleasure craft, even lifeboats stripped from passenger liners. They were not armored, not bristling with guns, and yet they sailed directly into a battlefield. For German officers accustomed to calculating tonnage and firepower, the sight was absurd. "Madness," one Luftwaffe observer muttered. "These are not warships." But the madness did not scatter. One after another, the small boats pressed on, their bows slapping against waves churned by strafing aircraft. Stuka sirens shrieked overhead, bombs erupting in columns of spray, yet the craft wove forward through danger. On shore, thousands of trapped soldiers watched the impossible unfold. Men raised helmets, waved scarves, shouted hoarse encouragement as the first civilian hulls reached shallow water. By the end of that first day, estimates suggest more than 7,000 troops were lifted from the beaches. Some climbed rope ladders onto paddle steamers, others clambered into fishing boats, where civilians in raincoats and flat caps hauled them aboard with calloused hands. The contrast was staggering. Men who had faced mechanized blitzkrieg only hours before now found salvation in the arms of pensioners, fishermen, and weekend sailors. German command posts grew uneasy. Reconnaissance flights returned with photographs showing vessels scattered like ants across the channel. The evacuation was no token gesture. It was coordinated, escalating. Officers who had spoken confidently of annihilation now wondered aloud whether the Luftwaffe could stem the tide. After all, their reports recorded only dozens of boats in the morning. By nightfall, dozens had become hundreds. Still, disbelief reigned. The German staff clung to the idea that such flimsy craft could not sustain large-scale rescue. Surely, once a few sank, the rest would turn back. Surely, terror would outweigh loyalty. Yet on the beaches, the mood shifted. Soldiers who had slumped in despair now felt urgency. If small boats could pierce the German gauntlet, perhaps entire armies could be saved. As twilight fell, bonfires were lit once again on the sand, not just for warmth, but as signals guiding more boats toward the shore. What began as a trickle was already becoming a flow, and German officers were forced to reframe the question. It was no longer whether the Allies could escape. It was how many and how fast.
By the second and third days, the channel looked less like a battlefield and more like a migration. German binoculars swept the horizon and froze. From one edge of sight to the other, lines of tiny boats stretched across the water, sails and smoke funnels dotting the waves like a scattered fleet. Tugboats belched black exhaust beside sleek paddle steamers. Lifeboats cut stubborn wakes alongside Thames ferries, stripped of passengers and loaded with soldiers. England, it seemed, had emptied its harbors. For the Wehrmacht officers stationed near Dunkirk, disbelief hardened into recognition. This was no random dash of civilians. It was an armada, mobilized with speed that defied German planning. Reports tallied hundreds of vessels. By June 4, over 860 had been counted. Each one ferried not cargo or commerce, but fragments of an army that should have been destroyed. On shore, soldiers cheered as steam whistles echoed across the surf. Men waded chest deep, clutching rifles above their heads, desperate to clamber onto anything afloat. Civilians hauled them aboard by the dozens, cramming decks beyond safety. Yet the boats kept coming, swelling into an endless procession. German staff officers began exchanging terse messages. The Kriegsmarine could not respond effectively. Submarines were too few, heavy warships too exposed in shallow waters. That left the Luftwaffe, whose commanders claimed victory was inevitable. Bomb them, sink them, scatter the flotilla. But the sight offshore suggested something darker for German strategy. Quantity was overwhelming quality. For every vessel crippled, more appeared, filling the gaps like water rushing into a trench. The shock was not merely numbers, it was the nature of those numbers. Fishing trawlers not built for combat, pleasure craft never intended for war, even cargo barges hastily converted to troop carriers. Ordinary vessels fused into extraordinary resolve. Allied soldiers whispered among themselves that England itself had sailed across the Channel. The officers tasked with watching Dunkirk wrote reports tinged with frustration. England has emptied its harbors, one intelligence summary noted grimly. The arithmetic was changing. Annihilation was slipping through German fingers. Yet confidence lingered in one quarter. The Luftwaffe still promised decisive action. Dive bombers were loaded, crews briefed. The next morning, Stukas would scream down upon the beaches and the armada below. German officers braced themselves to watch history end in fire. Morning broke over Dunkirk with a sinister hum. German officers tilted their heads skyward as the first formations of Stuka dive bombers cut across the cloud line. Sirens mounted beneath the wings wailed like banshees, their mechanical scream designed to unnerve soldiers below. On the beaches, men threw themselves into sand hollows, faces pressed against grit as bombs detonated in thunderous chains. Water plumes rose higher than masts, and black craters gouged the shore. To German eyes, this was supposed to be the kill stroke. The Luftwaffe's dive bombers had shattered columns across Europe, bridges in Holland, tanks in France, convoys in Belgium. Now, here at Dunkirk, they were tasked with ripping apart the evacuation fleet. But reality proved harsher than expectation. RAF fighters swept in from the west, intercepting squadrons before they could reach the densest clusters of vessels.
Spitfires and Hurricanes tangled with Messerschmitt escorts in lethal spirals above the channel. On the ground, survivors recalled the roar of engines colliding overhead as much as the bombs themselves. Amid the chaos, boats continued their steady shuttle. Soldiers sprinted across piers made from abandoned trucks lashed together, ducking gunfire, clambering into craft even as bombs fell yards away. A destroyer rocked from near misses, yet kept its gangway open until the last man was aboard. German officers peered through binoculars, expecting devastation. Instead, they watched as plumes cleared to reveal more boats arriving. Reports logged a bitter fact. In 9 days, the Luftwaffe would lose 177 aircraft trying to crush the evacuation. British losses mounted too, but the essential fact could not be denied. Men were still being lifted out. An officer's diary later admitted the frustration. Why are they still lifting them out? It was not just defiance, it was logistics, coordination, and sheer persistence. The bombs created chaos, but they did not halt the tide. Soldiers kept moving, vessels kept loading, and every attack seemed only to harden Allied resolve. As the Luftwaffe reeled from unexpected attrition, German eyes turned upward once again. Clearly, something was shielding these fragile boats. It was not luck. It was the silent guardians of the sky, fighting just out of sight. The question became, how had Britain managed to defend such a fragile lifeline in the very teeth of German air power?
High above the choking smoke and pounding surf, another battle raged, largely invisible to the men crouched on Dunkirk's beaches. German officers on the ground saw only sudden bursts of fire in the sky, contrails twisting like white scars across the blue. What they could not see was the shield being forged overhead. RAF squadrons, operating at the very edge of their fuel range, darted into combat again and again, intercepting Stukas before they could strike in force. 15,000 feet above the channel, Hurricanes and Spitfires tangled with Messerschmitt escorts. Engines howled as metal tore through the air at breakneck speeds. Pilots fought in tight circles, sometimes so close they could see enemy faces through cockpits. German logs recorded surprise at the sheer persistence. "We thought skies were ours," one officer admitted after reviewing reports. Yet every hour, RAF fighters reappeared, their bases just across the channel enabling relentless rotation. On the beaches below, men only sensed the consequences. Bombing raids came in fewer waves, and some landed harmlessly offshore, their formations already disrupted by dogfights. The steady procession of evacuation craft continued. Destroyers, paddle steamers, fishing boats, all protected by an umbrella that was largely unseen but deeply felt. By conservative counts, more than 200,000 troops would owe their survival to that airborne shield. German frustration mounted. For months, the Luftwaffe had dominated Europe's skies, strafing and bombing with near impunity. Now their edge seemed blunted. The losses, 177 aircraft during the operation, were not catastrophic in isolation, but the failure to stop the evacuation was undeniable. Officers who had promised quick victory found themselves explaining why British fighters, supposedly outnumbered, had frustrated their mission. On the ground, survivors recalled the odd juxtaposition. Terror at the scream of bombs, then sudden relief when friendly fighters roared overhead. For German commanders, the juxtaposition was more painful. An air force built to terrorize was being stalled by defenders they had underestimated. The implications reached beyond Dunkirk. If the RAF could blunt the Luftwaffe here, perhaps they could defend their homeland too.
German officers began to whisper a new unease. This evacuation might not be a defeat for Britain, but a rehearsal for resistance. And as officers scribbled their doubts, their attention was drawn to another front in the battle. Not the sky, but the machinery of supply and transport that kept the evacuation alive.
Beneath the fury of air raids, another war unfolded. One measured not in dogfights, but in logistics. German officers scanning the channel realized the evacuation was more than pluck or luck. It was machinery, numbers, and organization operating at a scale they had not anticipated. What began with a flotilla of small boats was now reinforced by naval craft, ferries, and transports moving in endless lines back and forth. Everywhere, movement defied German predictions. British destroyers dashed in under fire, loaded decks to the rails, and sprinted back to Dover. Minesweepers cleared lanes again and again, even as bombs fell around them. Tugboats towed barges stacked with soldiers, while hastily lashed piers of trucks and planks extended into the surf, allowing faster loading. From above, it resembled a conveyor belt, troops flowing west as ships rotated east, almost mechanical in its rhythm. Reports logged by German intelligence made grim reading. By the height of the evacuation, over 220 naval craft had been committed, alongside hundreds of civilian vessels. Fuel depots across southern England fed the operation through pipelines and tanker trucks, ensuring the shuttle never paused. Each evening, more ships appeared as if conjured from nowhere. For German planners used to the idea of blitzkrieg, speed-crushing preparation, the tempo seemed reversed. Here, Britain was moving faster than German disruption could keep pace. One officer's report admitted unease. "Our industry cannot match this tempo." It was a telling line. The Wehrmacht had conquered nations in weeks, but those victories leaned on improvisation and seized resources. Britain, by contrast, demonstrated coordination across navy, civilian sector, and industry, building bridges of steel and fuel across the channel. On shore, soldiers noticed the difference too. Instead of chaos, evacuation became ordered. Columns marched onto vessels, officers checked rosters, equipment was stacked systematically. Even under fire, the rhythm grew steady. The enemy had expected panic, but what they saw was a machine in motion. For German commanders, the nightmare deepened as numbers kept climbing. Evacuation was no longer a symbolic gesture, it was industrial-scale salvation. And as daily tallies swelled, disbelief spread through German reports. If Britain could mobilize its civilians, navy, and factories with this speed for retreat, what would happen when they shifted the same engine toward resistance or offense? That question haunted officers staring at the numbers pouring back across the channel. And the numbers themselves soon became the true shock.
In war rooms across occupied France, German officers bent over daily reports, and the numbers made no sense. What was supposed to be annihilation was turning into a ledger of survival. Each morning, tallies arrived from coastal observers, tens of thousands gone. One day recorded 68,000 evacuated in 24 hours, more men than some entire divisions. By June 2, the total had already reached 300,000. The arithmetic tore at German confidence. Their soldiers had advanced with ruthless speed across Belgium and France, believing the cornered British Expeditionary Force could not slip away. Yet the figures kept climbing, day after day, like a clock ticking against them. The Wehrmacht's narrative of triumph was unraveling in columns of rescued men. At Dunkirk itself, the pace was visible. Endless lines of helmets and packs snaked down improvised piers, men marching steadily onto ships. Civilians in small craft transferred soldiers by the dozen, sometimes hundreds in a single crossing. Destroyers returned blackened by shrapnel, only to load again. It was relentless. German spotters noted with bitterness that every night the beaches seemed emptier, every morning more soldiers were missing. For officers, the psychological impact was heavier than the tactical one. They had been promised a crushing victory, one that would decapitate Britain's fighting power. Instead, they watched as the supposed prisoners vanished across the channel. The phrase, "it should have been annihilation," appeared in more than one German log, a confession of disbelief. Even Hitler's command circle wrestled with the contradiction. How could the most powerful army in Europe, supported by its vaunted Luftwaffe, fail to prevent such an escape? The explanations varied: bad weather, British luck, overstretched panzers. But the reality was simpler and harsher. Britain was not breaking, it was bending into survival. For the men on the beaches, those numbers meant hope. Each day, soldiers glanced skyward, counted ships offshore, and whispered about the tally. Was it 200,000 yet? 250,000? The evacuation itself became a statistic in motion, each man a digit in a race against German artillery. And when captured later, British POWs carried those stories into camps, spreading the shock further. There, German guards heard first-hand accounts of order, scale, and endurance that contradicted propaganda. The disbelief that had begun in war rooms was now echoing in the barbed wire enclosures of prisoner camps.
When some British soldiers were eventually captured in France and shipped into German camps, their captors expected demoralized, broken men. Instead, they found prisoners who carried stories of Dunkirk, stories that unsettled even the guards. Tales of civilians steering boats through gunfire, of thousands rescued under the noses of the Wehrmacht, clashed with the German narrative of Allied collapse. The very existence of these men testified to survival, not defeat. But the deeper shock came later, when German officers themselves compared how prisoners were treated across lines. In Germany, rations were meager, hygiene was poor, and discipline often brutal. Meanwhile, news filtered back from across the Atlantic that captured Axis troops in Allied hands were living under conditions that seemed almost impossible. In the United States, Red Cross trucks delivered food parcels to POW camps with clockwork precision. By some counts, 24,000 parcels a week were distributed in Arkansas alone. Each parcel contained items unimaginable to men at Dunkirk's beaches: chocolate, coffee, cigarettes, tinned meat, even soap. Axis prisoners wrote home describing hot showers, sports leagues, and organized cultural programs. Guards allowed them to form bands, publish camp newspapers, even stage plays. For German officers steeped in strict militarism, it was disorienting. They feed their prisoners while rescuing armies, one report noted with open contempt. The contradiction ran deep. The same industrial capacity that had fueled Dunkirk's evacuation also supplied humanitarian logistics at scale. German POWs compared their treatment under Allies to the neglect sometimes shown by their own officers, who rationed food harshly and punished discipline failures without mercy. That contrast eroded certainty about the inevitability of German supremacy. For British prisoners, the cultural shock worked both ways. Inside German camps, they discovered how thinly stretched the Reich's resources were. Meals often meant watery soup, black bread, and little else. Guards muttered about shortages, even as they tried to project control. In whispers, British POWs reminded each other that back home, their own country was still feeding an army of hundreds of thousands because Dunkirk had made it possible. This divergence, Allied abundance versus German austerity, echoed through every rumor and diary. It painted a picture of a war where compassion and logistics intertwined, where prisoners were treated with more care by enemies than by their own command. And just as Dunkirk's evacuation had depended on civilians, so too would the suffering of civilians under fire shape the next chapter of the story. Away from the beaches, Dunkirk's town itself became a battlefield. German bombers circled overhead, dropping payloads not only on the harbor but into narrow streets packed with refugees. Roofs collapsed into courtyards, glass shattered across cobblestones, and fires roared unchecked. Yet amid the destruction, civilians refused to retreat. Women carried buckets of water through rubble to thirsty soldiers. Families opened cellars as improvised shelters for the wounded. Even as bombs fell, locals ferried food and messages toward the shoreline. German reports acknowledged the devastation. The Luftwaffe flew sortie after sortie against the town, determined to choke the evacuation at its source. By the end, more than 1,000 civilian casualties were recorded. Still, Allied soldiers recalled the quiet bravery of Dunkirk's residents, an old woman handing out bread through the smoke, a young boy leading men to safety down back alleys. These were not soldiers, yet they bore themselves like comrades in arms. For German officers, the spectacle jarred. Their doctrine relied on terror breaking morale. Instead, they saw ordinary people enduring what military formations often could not. One intelligence officer admitted with bitter respect, "Even their women defy us." The Reich's propaganda machines struggled to spin such stories. How could fishermen, shopkeepers, and mothers withstand what Europe's armies had failed to resist? Inside the town, daily life became a study in resilience. Firefighters battled blazes with barely functioning pumps. Priests led processions through streets under bombardment, offering prayers amid collapsing walls. Meanwhile, the constant flow of wounded through makeshift hospitals underscored the human cost of resistance. Civilians became stretcher bearers, nurses, and guides, without training, without orders, just necessity. To Allied soldiers, those acts mattered deeply. Exhausted men waiting for rescue took strength from small gestures, a hand offering water, a blanket dragged across a smoking street. Civilians reminded them that Dunkirk was not just a military episode, but a human ordeal shared by all. For German observers, the sight cut deeper. It suggested that Britain's fight was not confined to uniforms. It was in the hands of civilians, in communities willing to absorb punishment, yet still act. And just as the town burned, the beaches remained alive with evacuation. The climax of that desperate week was fast approaching. In the final nights of June 3 and 4, the last columns would march into the surf under torchlight, closing one of the most improbable chapters of the war.
By June 3, Dunkirk's beaches were nearly bare. What had been a churning mass of hundreds of thousands was reduced to the last stubborn pockets, men waiting in silence, knowing time was almost gone. That night, torchlight flickered across the sand as officers whispered commands. Columns of soldiers filed toward the surf, boots crunching on pebbles, rifles slung across shoulders. They marched without fanfare, only the hiss of waves and the distant thrum of aircraft engines breaking the quiet. Flares arced overhead, thrown by German gunners, bathing the shoreline in ghostly white. Shadows of men stretched across the water as destroyers edged close, decks already crowded with evacuees. In the dark, fishing boats and tugs continued their shuttle, bumping against each other in the rush to take on the last survivors. Every lantern covered, every voice hushed, yet the urgency was unmistakable. Reports indicate more than 26,000 soldiers were lifted in that single night, the final surge of Operation Dynamo. By dawn on June 4, silence settled on the beaches. Where once rifles and helmets lay scattered, now only wrecks remained. Burnt-out vehicles, abandoned artillery, the detritus of an army that had escaped. German patrols advancing into the dunes found emptiness where they expected captives. For German officers, the revelation was stunning. They had braced for the satisfaction of capturing tens of thousands, perhaps the remainder of Britain's expeditionary force. Instead, they found sand littered with wreckage, but devoid of men. "They are gone, vanished across the Channel," one field report stated bluntly. The shock was not only strategic, but symbolic. An enemy surrounded, starved, and hammered had simply slipped through their fingers. The survivors themselves described the departure as surreal. Silent figures boarding ships under moonlight, engines throttled low, spray slapping hulls as the armada turned westward. Many expected shells to rain down or aircraft to intercept. Instead, darkness was their shield. By sunrise, the last vessels had crossed into safety, leaving behind a wasteland. For the Reich, Dunkirk's beaches became a reminder that numbers, technology, and planning were sometimes outweighed by endurance and chance. And as German officers absorbed the bitter outcome, higher command awaited their reports, struggling to explain how a cornered enemy had re-emerged as an army of hundreds of thousands. The disbelief now spread beyond the beaches, carried into the corridors of German headquarters, where staff officers pored over the staggering totals.
When the reports finally reached German headquarters, the tone was grim. Numbers filled the pages like accusations. 198,000 British soldiers, 140,000 French, nearly 330,000 men had escaped. Officers who had confidently described Dunkirk as a trap now faced the bitter reality that the trap had sprung open. The Luftwaffe had failed to crush the evacuation. The Wehrmacht had watched its chance at total victory dissolve across the Channel. For some, disbelief shaded into anger. How had a ragged collection of fishing boats and ferries humiliated the most modern army in Europe? How had Britain, written off as beaten, salvaged not just fragments, but the core of its fighting strength? Reports offered explanations: fog, stubborn resistance, the RAF's interference, but none softened the truth. The British Expeditionary Force lived to fight again. Among junior officers, frustration found voice in private diaries. "We will now face them again." They understood that survival at Dunkirk meant Britain would not sue for peace. Instead, those men would return, rearmed and reinforced, carrying with them the memory of a miracle. What was supposed to end the war in the West had become the seed of prolonged conflict. In prisoner of war camps, captured British soldiers confirmed the narrative. They spoke openly of torchlight columns, of civilians risking everything, of ships loaded beyond safety steaming into Dover. German guards listened with disbelief, some skeptical, others silent, but the facts circulated regardless. Dunkirk could not be erased. For Allied propaganda, the evacuation was transformed into legend almost immediately. But even stripped of embellishment, the core truth stood. Germany had been outmaneuvered not on the battlefield, but in the realm of resilience and willpower. An enemy dismissed as cornered had proved capable of extraordinary escape. In Berlin, senior commanders noted the bitter irony. Victory in France remained secure, but it had not been absolute. The army that was supposed to vanish had instead crossed the Channel intact. What should have been the Reich's triumph had become a warning. Britain was still in the fight. The beaches of Dunkirk, once filled with desperate men, were now empty, silent witnesses to one of the most improbable reversals in modern war. And the officers tasked with explaining the failure were left with a single uncomfortable truth: the enemy they thought destroyed was coming back.